Mark Twain presents the tale of two men and asks, who is the most virtuous? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, and a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to talk about some fun short form literature that I've encountered from a familiar author. Today I wanted to talk about a short story that focuses on a hard-working man and a person who is lazy. I am referring to Edward Mills and George Benton, A Tale by Mark Twain, which was published in 1880. For those who don't know, I've talked about Mark Twain on this channel before, so I don't need to go into that great of detail. But for those who don't know, Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, as he was more commonly known. That was his actual name, whereas Mark Twain was a pen name. He was a writer who lived throughout the 1800s. He primarily wrote Americana-type literature, whether it be in books, short stories, or even some nonfiction that he wrote. Most notably, he wrote about Tom Sawyer, and he also wrote Huckleberry Finn, two stories which are frequently discussed in high school or middle school classrooms in Western cultures. And then he also wrote a number of short stories. I've talked about the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County before, and here I am talking about another one. And again, as I mentioned, he does talk about Americana, defining the American experience, but it is a very white experience, I've found. While I hesitate to fully call Mark Twain racist, I do note that his vision of America was not that great for people of color, similar to what you might find with other writers at the time. And that's important to note because, again, this country is more than just Southern white people. And that seems to be primarily what Twain was writing about. But without further ado, let's talk about this short story. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Edward Mills and George Benton, A Tale, focuses, of course, on the titular Edward Mills and George Benton. They are cousins who are raised together by a similar set of parents, and very clearly, even from their young age, it's obvious that they are very different young men. Edward is calm and thoughtful. If he's told no, he accepts that no, whereas George is loud and rude, and he'll whine until he gets his way. It's clear like Edward is more rational than George is. And as they grow up, they're both given an opportunity to be an apprentice, and Edward becomes dutiful and hardworking, whereas George spurns his work and even actively runs away because he doesn't want to deal with any of those responsibilities. It's even said that they had his parents have to bribe George in order to get him to obey or do anything. And then this continues even as the parents get older. As they die, they leave most of the money in the will to George, or they leave the estate to him, and say that he needs it more than Edward because, again, Edward is hardworking, but George is a bit lazier. George is instructed to take the estate, take the money, and buy out Edward's business partner so that they can work together, presumably so Edward can keep George on the straight and narrow. But even in that case, George still lives a sinful life of alcohol and laziness, not really doing a lot of work and gambling quite a bit. While Edward builds up a sizable wealth for his family, providing for them and being a dutiful member of various organizations, maintaining his fees that he has to pay, or those dues that he has to pay, and being a well-regarded member of the community, kind of living off the principle that his parents said, like if you're loyal, wise, dutiful, and whatnot, you'll never be in want want of money, or you'll never be in want of friends. It's sort of living by those principles, where George is not living by that. Unfortunately, due to George's incessant gambling, they lose the family business. The state comes and repossesses that. And so both Edward and George are kind of out of a job. And Edward has to struggle to make ends meet, having to beg on the streets and take any side job that he can, eventually coming to be a cashier for a bank, which seems to indicate that he has kind of fallen pretty far. Whereas with George, the community takes pity on him. The temperance movement society provides for George, and even gets him like a speaking tour. They allow him to go and speak and gain some notoriety from that, and even further than that. Once like George gets arrested once, and when he gets out, the Friends of Prisoners Society provides a sort of safety net for him to fall on while he's getting out of prison. So things seem to be a little bit easier for George, but that's probably because he's not even trying that hard. And unfortunately, one night, Edward is working at the bank when a group of burglars come in and demand to know the code or the key for the safe. Edward refuses to tell them, and they kill him as a result. And a short while later, it's revealed that George was one of those burglars who killed him, which is a pretty terrible thing to do to your cousin. And he is sentenced to death at that point, where he goes through trial. And some pity again develops for him, especially as he converts or is born again and finds religion in prison. And there are people who try to petition the government to save him, but that doesn't work, and he is executed. And as the story comes to a close, the narrator notes that on their headstones it reads different things. Where it says George it said that he fought the good fight. For Edward, it repeats the family motto that if you're dutiful, loyal, and hardworking, you'll never be in want of either friends or money or something like that. So indicating that Edward is probably better remembered by the community. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with this tale. One of the things that Twain is talking about here is the comparison between Edward and George. It's a very interesting way that he compares these two individuals. Edward is thoughtful and rational, as we see throughout the story. He's more hardworking. He cares more about those around him and is willing to provide for them. Whereas George is compulsive and driven by emotion. When he's younger, if he doesn't get what he wants, he whines about it, and when he's older, he spurns his responsibility, doesn't really commit to doing anything, and kind of lives off others. Not a very good person to want to be around, because he's constantly taking advantage of the kindness of others and not committing to bettering himself or anything like that. There is an interesting quote that I want to read to you from this. Baby Mills was a comfort to everybody about him. When he wanted candy and could not have it, he listened to reason and contented himself without it. When baby Benton wanted candy, he cried for it until he got it. And so there you see a very interesting kind of comparison between those two individuals. It's what Twain is striving for in his story, just comparing these two people, and ultimately showing what righteous behavior truly is. Because he wants you to kind of see that Edward Mills is a good person and a model for the behavior that you should have in society. Whereas you should not see yourself in George Benton. If you do, that's an indicator that you need to do some work on yourself. And it's a very interesting way of kind of comparing them, but it also kind of feels like the Goofus and Gallant cartoons that you saw in Highlights magazine. If you've ever read those, they usually showed up in the doctor's offices of all places. But it was basically like Goofus does this bad thing, whereas Gallant does a great thing and is meant to be an example for children everywhere. And maybe this is intended for children. It certainly feels like it's more meant for adults. It's more meant to be like a humorous kind of story, short story for adults. So it does feel like it's kind of kind of like a basic example, whereas maybe you could add more detail or add more nuance to sort of what is good behavior and what is bad behavior there. Another interesting aspect of this story is the cynical humor that Mark Twain utilizes. Twain seems to be negatively portraying a society that rewards George's behavior, because as you can see throughout the story, he does a lot of bad things, but society seems to reward that bad behavior through money or resources or help in some form or way. George is rewarded for squandering money, while Edward has to beg, as a good example. George is given a speaking position for the temperance movement, while again, Edward sort of has to take on jobs that are probably below his skill level just to make those ends meet. You get those speaking positions, you get George being pitied by a larger society, even after he does things that harm those around him. And it's funny because even after he kills somebody, his own cousin, he finds religion, and suddenly everybody wants to petition the governor to excuse or let him or pardon him in some way, which the governor does not do, and actually still commits him to being sentenced to death. And so I think what Twain is trying to do is he's trying to portray society for how it is, how it rewards those people. And he's introducing a little humor to get you to consider, like, oh, does society, truly value those we consider to be noble? Or does it actually allow people like George to thrive and actively harm people and still get his behavior excused? I see a lot of that in, our modern society. People like Donald Trump, people like Mike Pence, and a bunch of other people who do some of the worst things imaginable, but they get their behavior excused by those in power or their supporters. And you see that on various sides of the political spectrum, where some of the worst people end up getting redeemed in some way because they're those people, there's a sense of pity for those people, but even in pitying them, you still reward and endorse that behavior, even if it's a mistake. So Twain is being very cynical here. He's kind of using humor to call out a very real problem that existed for him in the 1880s. Twain also touches upon nobility in this story through Edward's behavior. Edward's behavior is seen as pure and honest, and when he dies, he's remembered as that pure and honest man. While George is merely said to have fought the good fight. That's on his gravestone. I think what that means is he lived a life of many vices, and he tried to fight those vices, but he might not have been successful because he wasn't really committed to fighting those vices, which is a very kind of damning way to view people who are said to have fought the good fight. Besides the people who do actual social justice work, other people who spend their lives dealing with substance use or something like that. If you say they fought the good fight, what is that actually trying to say? Twain is not being positive here at all. And then, again, Edward is said to have been noble and virtuous and honest, and he was not in want of friends or money, because he seemed to do pretty well for himself. And even after he died, the community raised money for his family because they saw his commitment to not letting criminals, get the upper hand and get money from the bank safe as a good thing. They chose to reward his family after that. And so what Twain could be arguing here is that there's redemption in paradise, that you might not be that well regarded in your life, or it might seem like bad people get rewarded in life, but after you die, there's redemption in paradise. Good people go to heaven, bad people are remembered for being bad, and they go to hell. That's not always the case, I would say. Sometimes that only applies if you believe in the Christian afterlife, because not everyone necessarily goes to hell in other religions. and also not everyone who is bad is necessarily remembered for being bad. A good example is Henry Kissinger, who, although people on Twitter seem to think that he was an awful person, and in fact he was, a lot of other people remember him as a noble and great head of state, or not head of state, but a secretary of state, someone who fought for the interest of the United States and is worthy of being remembered, which is not really true, but that's how they remembered him. So the bad, the dishonest people aren't necessarily always punished, like Mark Twain would have you believe here. And it also suggests that we should tolerate this kind of behavior while it's happening, that we should just allow, miscarriages of justice for people like Edward to take place because they'll be rewarded in the afterlife. And we should just tolerate George's behavior because he'll be effectively punished afterwards. Whereas no, that this dude is causing suffering now. We should do about that. We shouldn't just wait until afterwards, and we should work now to point out a person's flaws and how they're harming the people around them, because there's something that you can do about it now. And it does feel like Mark Twain is being a little too passive here, and is just, again, going by that Christian mindset where, oh, you don't have to worry about it now because all things will happen in due time. And sometimes we don't really have due time, especially if you don't subscribe to the Christian view of the afterlife, and you recognize that this mortal form is all we have. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Edward Mills and George Benton tale. As you can see, I have a number of problems with the short story. It is particularly interesting from a historical standpoint because it is a Mark Twain story, but I do think that there are better stories out there that get at like the discrepancy between two people and how one is virtuous and how another one is not. So I don't think this is necessarily one that you need to seek out, but it is important to talk about because it is from one of America's more well-known authors and one who is considered one of the best. But again, like this is very superficial in the differences between two people, and I feel like a better writer would have, again, added more nuance, but also talked about how there's a need to focus on things now rather than later. Which maybe that in a roundabout way Twain is talking about, especially with his use of cynicism here, but I don't feel it's completely effective at what he's trying to do. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on this, let me know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you and have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this short story or this author if they're one of the people who don't already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about books or movies or whatnot. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and virtuous travels. Farewell.